Hi, everyone. It's 4:30, so we're going to get started. My name is Flora Solomon, and welcome to By The Book. It's an interactive webinar brought to you by our co-hosts, cousins Peter, Danny, and John Boockvar. Peter is a CNBC contributor and CIO of Bleakley Advisory Group, and John is Vice Chair of Neurosurgery at Lenox Hill Hospital, where he's leading clinical trials in COVID disease and working on the front lines in the COVID ICU. Danny, John's twin, is president at Thrasio, the largest acquirer of Amazon third-party private label businesses, and has 20 plus years of experience leading fast-growing consumer businesses for global brands, such as the NFL and Weight Watchers. Johnny, Danny, and Peter are all leaders in their respective fields and will be answering your questions about health, wellness, finance, business, and life during this pandemic. Please keep your questions more general than specific because we want to make sure that they apply to the majority. With that being said, to ask your host questions, please direct your attention to the chat function. It's on the bottom right of your screen. You can submit questions, and depending on the topic, John, Danny, Peter, or our special guests will answer them respectively. As you can see, I've started the chat. Without further ado, take it away, Boockvars. Peter, you can start.
Thank you, Flora. I'm Peter Boockvar, and just a quick disclosure before we begin. John and Dan are not affiliated with Bleakley Advisory Group and Private Advisor Group, and nothing they say should be taken as investment advice, and nothing I say should be taken as medical advice. Johnny?
Actually, I'll take it, Peter. Thank you. Hi, I'm Danny Boockvar, president at Thrasio, former CEO of Circle Line Sightseeing, and president of the NFL Experience. I live on the Upper West Side, and very excited to be here today. I'll be moderating today's session. Johnny, over to you.
Okay, hi guys. Let me make sure I'm just helping Umer get on. My name is John Boockvar. I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm working at Lenox Hill Hospital. We're on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, part of Northwell Health, where we're sort of in the middle of the epicenter of the epicenter, if you will, of this pandemic. Fortunately, just to give you sort of a state of the state, things are looking better than they were last week, and so I'd like to start with what are the trends that we're seeing and how we're doing. As you may have heard Governor Cuomo say today in his daily address, the number of deaths is falling, but falling slowly. We're in the mid-200s now, which is really great news. I will tell you, and we had Dr. Dursow last week, who runs our emergency room. Emergency room visits are at an all-time low right now, not just for COVID, but for everything. Right. So we are a very, very quiet emergency rooms now, which is good. It's a little scary because we don't know where the patients who are sick, if they're dying at home and not coming in for medical attention. But actually our emergency rooms are at an all-time low in visits. And fortunately our COVID numbers are going down. Just to give you the state of the affairs here at Lenox Hill Hospital, in the middle of this week, we basically have made tiers in our hospital where we have COVID-free floors, and we started doing surgeries, elective surgeries on Wednesday. And so if you need medical care, it is safe now to go back to hospitals. We have the systems in place to actually segregate the patients who are COVID positive and obviously keep you safe, and you can have surgery safely in U.S. hospitals now. So it surely is good news. We treat everybody as if they are potentially positive. We have enough PPE to make sure that our staff is safe. I today got antibody testing through Northwell Health. The general public and healthcare workers will be getting antibody testing, which we do with venipuncture, which is basically through the vein. So that's really good news, as it allows us to make sure our healthcare workforce is ready. And it's better this week than it was last week. Okay. So, Danny, want to introduce Umer?
Yeah, Umer, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome. So Umer Raffat, thank you for joining us. Senior Managing Director of Evercore and heads their large cap therapeutics effort spanning biotech. I understand, Umer, that you've been ranked #1 on 5 separate occasions by Institutional Investor. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Umer, I'm going to take it from here from Danny. And again, thank you for taking the time. I know we have to talk about the breaking news that just came across the wire with Donald Trump announcing that the FDA has approved remdesivir for the treatment of COVID. So with that, maybe I'll ask you the question, what is remdesivir and should we be excited about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, remdesivir is not a vaccine. It's for the actual treatment of COVID patients. So far, all the data we've seen on it has been in severe patients. These are patients, the way the trial was defined, these were patients that had a lung oxygen saturation below 94%. Maybe, John, you could speak to that a bit. But these were severe patients. They had a bit of a breathing difficulty. And within these patients, here's the data. It's not a silver bullet, but here's the data. If you don't take remdesivir, in a severe patient, odds of dying, 11%. In a severe patient, don't take anything, odds of dying, 11%. If you do take remdesivir, the odds of dying drops to 8%. If you take remdesivir early, the odds of dying might be 6.5%, 7% based on my calculations. We don't have that data yet. Again, this data I'm speaking to is not from small 30, 40 patient studies. These are from large, several hundred patient studies run by Dr. Fauci's team from NIAID. This is randomized control data, and we now have a clear survival benefit. It's not solving COVID, but is it reducing the mortality rate? Absolutely. It would have been 11%. It's going to track closer to 7% if you take remdesivir early, and it's an IV regimen.
So we have a clinical trial here at Northwell Health for remdesivir, and I can tell you we were always having trouble with the company providing drug. Could you just talk to that as more and more people now are going to be coming to our hospitals looking for this drug, and we've always had trouble procuring it?
Yeah. So, it's interesting you asked me that. There's two layers to the trial. First layer is the way Gilead's running the trials are, the way they're running it is a moderate and a severe trial, and there's like first few hundred patients which are in the randomized placebo-controlled phase, which Gilead is very focused on because that'll form the basis of publication. And everything beyond that, so everything beyond the first 400, beyond the first 600, are technically compassionate use or expanded access patients. So it gets called the trial, even though it's technically not the trial. And expanded access then needs to go through formal approval process on the Gilead website. I actually have a link to that if there's a patient that needs to request it for themselves or for a family member. I can share that on the call. And you're right, there is a little bit of a delay because you request it, then they approve it. They're like overwhelmed with requests. I can tell you, sent requests to the Gilead CFO for 2 or 3 people that reached out to me, and they're struggling with the sheer number of requests that come in. So they're processing it. I do know this. Their manufacturing capacity has improved materially. So in the next couple of weeks, Gilead should have close to 300,000 patients worth of drug available. So that's really good, and they've been stepping it up. So that's very good from that perspective. And I think this bottleneck you're seeing in getting people drug is going to start to resolve. And as the bottleneck resolves, people will get drug faster, and the faster and the earlier they get it into their COVID infection, the outcomes are better.
So in summary about remdesivir, you're happy about it. It's not a magic bullet, but it does provide some relief, particularly for the critically ill.
Absolutely. And the way I think about it is remdesivir drops the mortality from 11% to, let's say, 7%. I think we should now explore combinations like hydroxychloroquine potentially or JAK inhibitors, which might perhaps take it down towards 4 to 5%. If that can happen and we can say to everyone that, you know what, January, we first heard about COVID. By July, not only have we dropped the mortality, we've dropped it from 11% down to 4 to 5. I think that'll be a big feat. And I think it starts to show the tangible progress. This is, again, not hand-waving. This is tangible progress from actual randomized clinical trials.
You mentioned hydroxychloroquine, so why don't we touch on your opinion? There seems to be a lot of negativity now. Where it started with a lot of hype and obviously publicity from the White House. And now, after the FDA has warned against its use by the general public, where do you stand? Do you think there's a role in both prophylaxis and treatment of COVID?
So, I know it's become this, it's a very unfortunate tale of politicizing a drug, but I will just speak factually to it. If we look at how potent is remdesivir, the Gilead drug, for COVID, and how potent is hydroxychloroquine? Turns out they're both fairly similar in potency. The difference between the two was remdesivir was a Gilead drug, patented, branded. Gilead ran the trials, controlled the supply. They ran proper trials. They were incented to do the proper trials, and we just got the answer. Hydroxychloroquine, unfortunately, was not branded. It was generic. It was available to everybody, and guess what? Everybody had it. Everybody started running random trials and random comparisons on it, and we started seeing odd answers based on non-randomized trials. Every single trial on hydroxychloroquine that's come out, I can speak to not one, not two, at least 3 meaningful imbalances in the trial, which make the results non-interpretable. For those reasons, I think, in my opinion, hydroxychloroquine has never gotten a fair shake in terms of getting a proper trial so far. I will say that University of Minnesota has been running a prevention trial. So again, this is not a treatment trial. This is not after you have COVID. It's where you are experimenting with it for prevention purposes. And I think they have an early signal. They might have results in a week or so. And in their study, safety-wise, there's not been an issue. But to your point on safety with the hydroxychloroquine, of course, it has some cardiac toxicities in patients who have high QT at baseline. So again, in patients that have higher cardiac comorbidities at baseline, you do see some imbalances. But in an average healthy person, they're not seeing much of that. And there's a lot of clinical experience taking hydroxychloroquine for malaria, for arthritis, for lupus, etc.
Well, you mentioned arthritis. Go ahead, Dan.
You know, for those of us, you've been following Gilead for a while. I see their market cap is $100 billion at this point. You know, what does this mean for the company, and what else has Gilead been up to pre-COVID?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Gilead is a very large and profitable company, and I think it's important to mention first of all that Gilead is the preeminent leader in HIV. So most of some of the best HIV drugs and the cocktails that are out there, those are all Gilead drugs. So that's point number one. Point number two is Gilead also happens to be the leader in hepatitis C. And if you recall, the drug Sovaldi and Harvoni, those were Gilead drugs. The drug caused 100% cure. So that's very good. So pre-COVID, Gilead has $22 billion in sales in 2019. So it's a sizable company, mostly HIV. I think it's a $15 billion HIV business. They still have a $3 billion Hep C business. And they've been making huge investments into cell therapy for oncology purposes. And they will be launching a JAK inhibitor for ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, psoriatic arthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis, meaning they have a sizable business outside of COVID. Will they get some sales from COVID? They will inevitably get some sales, but keep in mind, first 300,000 people worth of drug, which is basically the public health emergency in the U.S. right now, they're donating all of it. And just to be clear, I'm not a Gilead representative or anything, nor do I have any financial interest in Gilead.
Right. Umer, this is Peter. Can I ask a quick question? Outside of remdesivir, are there any other hopeful drugs that are going to be right behind it that we're going to start hearing news on as a possible effective antiviral?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So look, the first thing I would say is, and I won't count hydroxychloroquine now, even though that's technically in either a viral entry inhibitor or some position like that. If I go beyond remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine, a drug that comes to mind is a friend of mine. He runs a fund called Ridgeback Capital, and they licensed the drug from Emory University into a company called Ridgeback Therapeutics. And his drug appears to have potency more or less similar to remdesivir, and it's oral, so that's a big difference. And they've just put it into human studies, so we could get data in the next 3 months. So that's a direct antiviral. The other drug I would point you to is, so again, remdesivir and perhaps the Ridgeback drug are both working on the polymerase, meaning they prevent the virus from replicating directly at the polymerase level. There are efforts on the protease inhibitor level. So Pfizer's got a protease inhibitor that I think is very potent, and they're putting it into humans in August. So I look at each of these efforts as an incremental step. So we know remdesivir got us from 11% mortality to 7%, and perhaps a protease inhibitor gets it towards 5%, perhaps hydroxychloroquine or something else could get it down lower. So it continues to build towards a cocktail which could be better and better. And we see that, by the way, in HIV. We see that in hepatitis C. That's Gilead's bread and butter. They structure cocktails.
Hey, Umer, I know we only have a couple more minutes with you. I have one question from the audience and then one other question, at least from me. So the question from the audience is, would love to hear your reaction to Fauci's optimism regarding the vaccine possibly by January and where we are on the supply chain for that vaccine. But also
we have no good data
vials.
to suggest that. Yeah, I don't think we have any definitive data to suggest that. The only thing I can speak to is a company called Moderna. They initiated a 45-person trial in mid-March. They had 3 doses, 25, 100, and 250. If the vaccine is working, they would probably be comfortable on the low end of the dose range, right? Turns out the next study they're going to be studying it at 50 microgram dose. So they may have a signal. We don't know, though. This is all conjecture right now. There's also an effort out of Oxford which just got partnered with AstraZeneca. But again, we've seen no data. So to your question about Dr. Fauci, there's no data that I'm aware of, and I gotta believe there's not a whole lot of data they've seen either. I mean, they might have early visibility, but you just don't know. If you've seen an early immune response, is that immune response sufficient to protect against COVID? We don't know. Also, do we know if it's going to be durable? We don't know. So there's a lot of questions.
And last one, Johnny or Peter, you go.
Well, I was going to ask you, Umer, about Pepcid. This week, obviously, there's been some excitement about famotidine or Pepcid, and your thoughts on whether you're taking that or any other drug prophylactically.
You know, it's a good question. I was looking at that, and the idea would be you change the acidity level, and the virus needs a certain acidic environment to get inside the cells. So, and by the way, that also happens to be the mechanism of action for hydroxychloroquine, changing the pH in those cell compartments. There's no definitive evidence yet, but I have seen some of that literature actually.
My last question, and then we'll move on. But before COVID, what was the most exciting biotech pick, or story that you were following?
Before COVID, across all biotech, I think the biggest areas of innovation have been, and I'm going to say in broad strokes, one, perhaps in dermatology for very severe forms of eczema. There's a drug from Regeneron called Dupy. There's a drug from Dermira which is very similar. Dermira just got bought by Lilly for that reason 2 months ago. That's one big area. Second big area is a target called IL-23, which is hugely efficacious in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and those therapies will be coming to market. And then if we look at oncology, the target called KRAS, which is 15% of all lung cancers and a bunch of colorectal cancers as well. And it seems like we've cracked the code on it, and it's huge. It could be enormously beneficial to those patients. There's some standalone companies with KRAS inhibitors as well. And finally, there's a company I cover called Biogen. John, you might have better thoughts on this, but they will potentially have an Alzheimer's drug next year. It's not clear what the actual effect size is, but theoretically they'll have a drug on the market. So those are some of the exciting areas.
I thought you were going to say Alzheimer's, and it felt like a good transition over to Kenny anyway. Umer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Umer.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
And I think now we'll take that lead. And I had thought, I don't know, Johnny or Peter, if you agree that, Alzheimer's was a key focus area pre-COVID. And I've been thinking about what investment areas like Alzheimer's are getting the short shrift now that everybody's focused on COVID. And maybe Kenny Boockvar, you'll talk about that. So welcome to Johnny and my older brother, Kenny Boockvar, who's a professor of geriatrics and palliative medicine at the Mount Sinai Hospital, and you're the director of clinical studies at the Jewish Home, and a renowned clinical researcher and author of many papers on dementia and Alzheimer's. You got top-notch training from Duke and Harvard, and regrettably for Johnny and I, you were the valedictorian of our high school, and together our grades couldn't equal yours. Welcome, Kenny. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
I guess to start off, what's the state that you see it from a geriatrician standpoint and someone who works closely with a senior population in nursing home?
Right. So thanks for a kind introduction. Yes, like Johnny has already described, we are optimistic that we're seeing a cooling off of this epidemic, which has been very hard on our older patients, including those in nursing homes. At Mount Sinai, which is my, academic home, we've seen reductions in COVID inpatients of about 5% per day. And it's under 1,000. Sounds like a lot still, but it's under 1,000 today for the first time in about a month across the system. And also in the nursing home setting, we see fewer patients, fewer sick patients. And I also have a foot in at the VA, at the Bronx VA hospital. And just echoing what John said, the emergency rooms are very quiet. We see no COVID or very few COVID patients, and also very few other patients. And I think one of the messages I have for the audience is to, not to be deferring care for other conditions, because we can definitely take care of you who have high blood pressure, diabetes, any other condition that you were seeing your doctor for. We are ready, to see you again and safely.
Kenny, are you seeing, obviously we have a lot of the vulnerable populations that are in your practice, or obviously the older populations, and they're sheltering in place. Have you heard, obviously that can be very emotionally stressful, particularly being separated from family, and if they're needing physical therapy or they're needing to get to the drugstore. How are they possibly handling this sheltering in place in that vulnerable population?
Mm-hmm. Right. So as you mentioned, a lot of our patient population is what we actually call homebound. There's a Medicare definition of homebound, which means that it's very difficult for you, if you are homebound, to leave the home without assistance. And so, I think that, the estimates are there are at least 2 million Americans who are homebound. And some of them actually need the same level of assistance as nursing home residents. So for every nursing home patient in the country, there's probably 2 or 3 others with a similar level of disability living at home. Now we, as a system, we don't actually provide long-term care services very well. We actually don't have, as you know, a government long-term care insurance benefit. And so people do struggle to obtain the services that they need at home. These are not, we're not talking about medical services, we're talking about nursing, or even just, regular daily self-care activities, such as getting dressed and getting around. So, one of the ways that we as geriatricians have tried to address this is to develop home visiting services, it could be, for example, a visiting doctor's program. Many, medical centers have these now. We have, we take COVID patients. So if they have a COVID illness at home, we will go in and still see them and provide medical and nursing care. We have something called hospital at home. So if somebody actually fulfills criteria for hospitalization, but are safely cared for at home, we have some teams that can do that, both on the the Mount Sinai and VA side. And so those are things that we've been working on for a while, several years, but probably there will be an uptick or uptake of those programs after this epidemic, when coming into the medical center for the same services may not be in the best interest of the patient.
Hey, Ken, this is Peter. So as part of the shelter in place, shifting to a reopening, those older people and elderly that have these pre-existing conditions, they're most concerned since they're most at risk. So what do we tell them? Fast forward to July, August, September, about going outside again, and since they are the most vulnerable, and how can they adjust and feel safe in lieu of effective therapeutics or whatever?
Yeah, good question. So some of this is, the answer is unknown because we don't know what the circulation of the virus is going to be in upcoming weeks and months. We do think that precautions should be taken that may seem over precautions, because you actually you do more than you think is necessary when you're talking about something like this, especially in the vulnerable population where if you get infected, unfortunately, the likelihood of a bad outcome is much higher. So we want to be super, maybe over careful, if you will. And so I would say, in the absence of, let's say we still don't know for sure what the risks are exactly, I would be over careful, and even in July, be saying to my 90-year-old patient who may have several chronic conditions to avoid going out, avoid going into places where there are groups of people, assuming that there may be groups of people. I would say, protect yourself, wash hands, wear a mask, basically similar to what we're saying now. That being said, one of the things that I have seen recently with my patients is some adverse effects of just sitting around too much. And so in my population, my patients, deconditioning is a big risk, and people who are older and 90 and not so active anyway, they can lose muscle mass and actually have problems if they're not getting up and about. So I would also encourage my patients and anybody else in a high-risk category to still stay active, still go out for that walk, keeping a distance, wearing a mask. Still, if you can, if there's place in your house, if you can do some strength training with or without, weights. So, these are things that I've been seeing that people are getting deconditioned from this sheltering in place.
You have particular medications, whether it's over-the-counter vitamins, supplements that you're recommending, vitamin C, vitamin D. We had Nutrition Shari on last week, and she's taking high doses of vitamin D. Is there a particular cocktail that you recommend to any of your patients?
My research hat, is one in which I look at the data as close as I can. And in fact, vitamin supplements, as let's say benign as they may be, also don't seem to have a lot of benefit. Even vitamin D, unfortunately, we don't find a lot of benefit from taking vitamin D. Now, that being said, they also don't cause that much, they really don't cause harm for the most part. So I don't object if one of my patients says, I'm going to take vitamin D. I think that could be a good idea. Most other vitamins, vitamin C, I don't see a strong rationale, especially if I have a patient who's struggling to manage their medicines, so they may already be on, a couple of blood pressure medicines, other medicines, diabetes, that I really do want them to take. If the vitamin is going to, if the vitamin is going to make it more complex, I'm going to prioritize the other medicines.
That's really interesting. Kenny, last question before we move on. You mentioned the VA, and I saw something today about 9/11 first responders having being a vulnerable population given their risk for cancer and other lung issues. Do you see the same for vets in the VA?
So veterans, and I didn't see the 9/11. I think some of the 9/11 exposure is really from the debris and dust and some of those toxic exposures. So the epidemic exposure is sort of it's a different exposure. I think veterans are interesting. I think they are perhaps a vulnerable group. They often fit into our high risk groups for COVID, severe COVID illness. So for example, they're men. 90% of them, actually in geriatrics, they're 95% men. So we know that's a higher risk group. They have chronic conditions, often, high blood pressure, vascular problems, sometimes obesity. They may be of a lower socioeconomic class or an underserved minority class. And so all of these we know are associated with worse outcomes in COVID. So we do have to take those into account.
We got one question actually two more questions from the audience while we still have you. Any recommendations for our homebound elderly loved ones, and what can we do to help them navigate anxiety around and for the elderly population that are homebound? You touched on some of it.
Yeah, it's really tough. So, certainly being in touch in any way, whether it's by, phone, landline, video calls, those can all be helpful. To actually be of practical help, there are some ways you can be of practical help. Certainly arranging deliveries, is maybe a hard thing for them to do. So if there's, a way that you can assist with a pharmacy delivery or grocery delivery, or bring items, yourself, that is a big help. I have seen, and I think this is worth, the audio. So basically the devices where you can command with audio the internet. So for example, Amazon Echo. These are things that are easy for older adults to use because all it takes is a voice command. And if you can set that up, they may actually have access to some of the features of the internet, whether it's music or information or ordering, without having to really know how to use a computer. So those devices, I think, can be useful. But it is a tough situation for sure.
Great. We may have time later for another question or two. We're going to end today at 5:15. So we're going to move on to our final special guest, David Rabin. How are you?
I'm well, sir. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for calling in also. Everybody, David Rabin, if you don't know him, is a renowned restaurateur, partner at the Lambs Club, Jimmy at the James, the Skylark, American Bar and Cafe Clover. You just opened some bars at the Venetian in Las Vegas. I know you've got a long and terrific history just in nightlife, bars, and restaurants all over the world. You're on the board of the Times Square Alliance and the New York City Hospitality Alliance. Thank you for being here today. We really wanted to talk about reopening our city and reopening our hospitality industry, and you're the right guy to talk to. So thank you in advance.
I hope so.
Yeah, right. I guess I'll kick off, and Johnny and Peter fill in right after me. But I think I saw estimates that restaurants are estimated to lose something like $50 billion in sales. I guess what's going on in your world with your particular restaurants, and how are you navigating the shutdown?
Well, I don't know about the final number, but all of our places are closed. We tried to do delivery from or takeout from one of them, but we were doing $500, $600, $700 a day, and people were it was very early in this process, and one of the chefs started not to feel well, one of the managers started not to feel well, and the partners just kind of got together on the phone and we're like, this is just crazy, to sell $600 worth of food and maybe get a bunch of people sick. It just amongst our staff, let alone what would happen outside. So we just shut the door on it. You're seeing some people reopen. You've probably gotten notices or seen in things like the West Side Rag. I have a feeling they're reopening only for 8 weeks will be my gut. I hate to say it, but I think a lot of them got PPP money and are accessing it, and you're supposed to spend that money within 8 weeks. But a lot of the relief that has been designed by the government has not really been designed with the hospitality industry in mind. The idea that 75% of that money is supposed to go to payroll doesn't really work in our industry, versus someone who may have an office and their rent might be 10% of their business. That's very different in the restaurant business. So we're basically, the restaurant industry is kind of freaking out, and the nightlife industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in New York, is freaking out even more, because whether or not people decide to go back and have, start having a burger at a distance or doing takeout, the inclination, we fear, and I have a call about this Monday specifically about nightlife, the inclination is, or the concern is how really those places need to be busy. You're not going to a nightclub. You may not go to a restaurant if it's half empty, but you're definitely not going to a nightclub or a bar that has 4 people in it. I mean, unless I guess you're on the Tinder date. But in the old school idea of going to a club because it was fun and lively, and no one really knows when that's going to happen again.
David, this is Peter. So there's speculation that when these restaurants reopen, that they're going to be limited in terms of capacity.
Yep.
What's the minimum capacity that makes the numbers work to reopen?
Well, I mean, every conversation is about that and about personal guarantees, which I can address if you want. But, 50% doesn't really work because it doesn't really change the number of people that are going to have to be in the kitchen, unless you vastly reduce your menu options, which then, of course, decreases the interest that people may have in what you're presenting. And also, there's a lot of issues about it's quite possible that your employees right now, even if they haven't gone home to live with their parents or live with friends, that they're earning more from unemployment than they would earn from coming back, via PPP. So there's sort of 2 moral issues. Do you try and get them to come off of unemployment and rejoin you, only to have to let them go again if it doesn't work? And then the other issue is, do you really ask people to ride the subways, which we've all seen? The majority of, particularly our back of house workers, they don't live on the Upper West Side or in West Village. They live in Queens, they live in the Bronx, they live in Brooklyn. So are you really morally, ethically, et cetera, supposed to tell them, hey, you got to come to work now? And they're like, wait, I'm making $1,000 a week to sit home and be safe. Now you want me to get on subway for less money? It's a very dicey situation. The other giant issue, which is kind of looming over everyone's heads, is very common. It doesn't happen to the most famous of operators, but it's very common in the restaurant industry to be forced to sign what's called a good guy clause, which essentially personally guarantees your lease. And the idea is, let's say you find that you're not doing well and you're 2-3 months behind in rent. If you go to the landlord and you give them 60 days notice and you pay up for the 3-4 months of rent that you're behind, you can terminate your lease. However, if you can't make that payment, they can accelerate the full value of your lease, and it's personally guaranteed. So hundreds, if not thousands, of restaurateurs right now are kind of looking at this with utter terror, because of course they haven't made any money in the last few months, and even at 50%, they won't make enough money to pay their rent. So almost everyone, and thankfully Corey Johnson has added it to a bill that he has introduced to the city council that everyone is sort of praying gets passed, that will negate the personal guarantees that come due during COVID because of COVID. PGs were not a terrible, and look, they're stressful no matter what, but it was a way to get out of a lease without having 8 more years of rent hanging over your head. But now it could easily become really the cause to bankrupt thousands of mom and pop operators who have one store that has 40 seats. I read online today about a guy who has 6 restaurants in the West Village, and he's facing, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars worth of personal liability if his landlords invoke this clause.
I know you recently opened the bars in Las Vegas. What's the story over there? Same as here or different?
Yeah, I just spoke to the global head of food and beverage the other night for Sands Corp. The three places we did are in the Venetian. Just big, beautiful bar lounges, no food. But the all of the strip is shut down. The Venetian admirably chose to pay everyone full pay, including tips, through May 15th. So the staff is fine at this point. I mean, they've been making really good money to not have to come to work, but no one really knows. I mean, you've seen the crazy mayor. She actually doesn't control the strip. She controls downtown Vegas. She's been on TV for weeks saying she wants to reopen, but no one I've spoken to is eager to get back to work. I can't even imagine the protocols that are going to have to come into place into a casino. I mean, who's touching chips? Who's touching cards? Who's touching dice? Who's doing any of that? Can't imagine wanting to do any of that or be in a crowded bar lounge. I mean, same deal. We don't face, these are owned by the Venetian, so we don't face the enormity of rent. It's not like a lease in those buildings, but all the other costs are still there.
What is there, as far as hospitality, we're starting to feel out whether patients are going to come back to New York City for healthcare because they're afraid, other cities are weaponizing COVID as, why would you go to a New York City hospital with the risks of COVID? You must feel that in all of hospitality, and it's going to take a major re-energizing of the hospitality industry to make, New York is safe again is going to be our slogan.
Well, I worry about it on many levels because, for example, one of our places, the Lambs Club, is on 44th between 6th and Broadway. So by day, we survive by people not telecommuting. They need to feel safe to go to their office and be at their law firm or be at Ernst & Young or be at Bank of America, which are our neighbors and, big supporters. And at night, our entire business is driven by theater, and which, of course, is also extremely driven by tourism. So it's also insanely interconnected that if theater doesn't bounce back, there's no way there'll be a nighttime business for any of the Times Square restaurants. And, it's a huge employer. And that, as Danny alluded to earlier in my intro, I do sit on the board of the Times Square Alliance, and, those conversations are not great because no one really knows what the future of Broadway looks like. And as such, all the businesses that survive because of it have no idea what they're going to do. And you could go down the list to parking garages and delis. And I mean, that whole ecosystem of, 40th Street to 48th Street really lives and breathes with Broadway. And then, of course, the convention business, like at the Marriott there, for example. They do tons of convention business. They have 3,000 rooms, smaller conventions. It's not like Vegas, but I don't know. They lost all their convention business. Right now, I guess they're housing people who are probably working with you,
Right.
Nurses who volunteered to come to New York. But
we're rolling out obviously antibody testing, and we hope to be able to surveil and see who's infected and trace them. But frankly, even antibody testing, unless we give out, some sort of passport that you're immune, which of course there's this whole counterfeiting of everything.
Right.
So it's reasonable to assume that a lot of that mass gathering is going to be impossible well until the fall, if not until early first quarter of 2021.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the reality that, I'm on a lot of calls with people who are like, well, they're planning for their July or August reopening. And I'm kind of just rolling my eyes. I'm doing the calls because I'm supposed to be on the calls because I'm a partner. But in my head, I'm like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Talking about menu planning. And I understand optimism and that you have to be prepared for the day that the gates open. But, we're lucky 2 of our spaces have substantial outdoor components. And so I'm hoping, and then of course Cafe Clover, which is our sort of healthful dining place downtown, has 50 outdoor seats. So sort of in the back of my head, I'm hoping that if we do get those places open, people may feel more comfortable outside in the breeze, fresh air, sunlight.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not going to be the numbers that we need to make money. It just may be enough to keep the brand alive until that time comes that there is a vaccine or there is immunity. You know, that, I mean, I got my antibody test 3 days ago. I'm waiting for the results. But as you said, no one seems to be able to tell me if that's going to make me actually immune or not. Right.
Well, that dovetails a question that we have about the reliability of antibody testing. So I figured maybe Kenny or I can handle that. Antibody testing is, there are two types, is qualitative and quantitative. So, you know, David, I don't know if you had a venipuncture where they drew blood.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And, they told you it was qualitative or quantitative.
Well, I'm waiting for the results. I went just, you know, I didn't know to ask that question. So I just ran to city. The first second I got we think our son had it. So we have a 19-year-old son. We think he had an extremely mild asymptomatic or almost asymptomatic case, but he couldn't smell anything for 2 weeks, and he had a very minor fever. He's been fine for 3 or 4 weeks. So the second we got this email saying, you know, come get a test, we just ran there. But we won't know the results for a day or two.
Yeah, I mean, qualitative is like a pregnancy test. You're either pregnant or not pregnant. You know, you don't get value for how pregnant you are. But we actually do have quantitative tests for how much antibody titer you have and you produce. And we're rolling that out at Northwell. Kenny, I'm not sure what Mount Sinai is doing for the employees, but I know a lot of our community up in Westchester, for example, is seeking out antibody testing. And frankly, I still don't understand per se how that's going to affect your business, David, unless in some capacity we know that a certain percentage of the population has developed the antibodies, and an overwhelming sort of herd immunity has occurred by September 1. That, you know, in New York or Manhattan, which, you know, according to the early data from the governor, of 3,000 patients tested in New York City, 21% had antibodies. So that's a very large number, which would be very good for your business if that number goes up by. That's the only way I can see mass gatherings in, you know, in your business locally happening. Kenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, the other weakness to the antibody test is that it's not specific. So you could have some other virus, you know, other than COVID, and the antibody test could be positive as a result of a different virus. You never actually had COVID. And so the test is not perfect. It works well in conjunction with the swab, which is very specific. So I've seen protocols where people are getting both the swab and the antibody test at the same time. And then there's some protocols where people are getting antibody tested twice, 2 weeks apart, because the trajectory of the antibodies, knowing that trajectory is helpful as well.
Hey, David, last question before we sign off for this week. So if you were lobbying Corey Johnson or the governor on behalf of the Restaurant Association or even tour and travel, would it be under the CARES Act or some equivalent, cover us for rent relief, cover us to hire and retrain, cover us to reorganize our space, cover us to provide safety equipment, cover us, you know, there's a lot of extra expense, time, and planning in addition to the rent relief and the PPP. And I presume that the training, the reorganizing, the safety equipment, none of that is covered in the CARES Act?
None of it has been discussed on all the webinars I've been on. So I'd love to say to my answer to you would be all of the above. You know, I think they all need to be looked at, but I can tell you that that's all with the intent of opening and having a safe and thriving business at some point. Right now, I would tell you that on the minds of almost everybody, unless they have a pure licensing deal and can just walk away, is this issue of personal guarantees and good guy clauses. That's what's got everyone completely in a pickle.
Is that a New York thing? Is that a New York thing? Or
I don't know if it exists in other states, but it's become extremely commonplace in New York that if you're a lone operator, let's say, not a blue chip company, you know, you're not. I doubt Chipotle has it, but you know, any of the restaurants you see when you walk up and down the West Side, I'm 99% sure, you know, that solo operator or that guy who's got 2-3 places has signed a personal guarantee that renders him liable in the event that he can't make his payments.
And Peter, I know we're not going to talk about a particular stock picks, but the Dardens and the Chipotles, which are public companies, I don't know much about how that industry is done. I've been following the cruise lines a little bit, and certainly tour and travel in the airplanes. But any insight there?
Yeah, well, Chipotle in particular has done very well in making the transition to the digital pickup delivery. Well, less so delivery, but that digital pickup model. So they've been able to weather it. But the difference between Chipotle and other businesses is, they have a balance sheet that can ride them through this difficulty, whether it's in terms of a lease or more months of stores not being open. But it's their pickup and delivery. They've made it work well enough. And Dave could speak better to this than I can, but the more of the quick service businesses can more adapt to that sort of world than the full service sit down type restaurants.
Yeah, 100%. And one, for I don't know how many people on the call, but one thing you can do to help the restaurants that are near you that may be doing pickup and delivery is to actually not use the Grubhubs of the world,
right.
And instead order directly from the restaurant, from their website, or if they have or from their app if they have one, but just call them because there's been one of the other things that's a big issue is that these delivery fees can be up to 30% of your bill. So that was a fight that was going on pre-COVID that the Hospitality Alliance was fighting a big battle about, hey, they're just gouging. But but now that it's your only money, so when we do not make our food in the house, I've been ordering from Chopped, Danny, it's right under my house pretty much. And what's nice is they have a button now, which I just noticed yesterday, that I can actually send a salad to a frontline healthcare worker. So it's cool that they have an app, but obviously that's a huge company. Cafe Clover is never going to have an app. We just hope that if we do reopen, people call us instead of calling, going through Seamless or something.
Right. Well, thank you, David, for joining us, and
Thanks,
really
David.
Appreciate that.
Sure, I appreciate it. All this has been so interesting.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. And that wraps this week's episode of By the Book. And we'll see you next week. Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.